Here is a one more quiz question on Spring Boot. Spring Boot is used for developing option A, web applications, option B, REST APIs, option C, microservices, option D, all of the above. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose the correct option. Well, you can mention your correct option in a comment section. The correct answer is all of the above. Well, Spring Boot is used to develop the web applications, REST APIs and microservices. And Spring Boot is basically developed on top of Spring Framework to reduce the boilerplate configuration and quickly create and set up the Spring based applications as well as the microservices. What is the minimum version of Java is required for Spring Boot 3? Option A, Java 8, option B, Java 11, option C, Java 17, option D, Java 21. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose the correct option. The correct answer is Java 17. Well, Spring Boot 3 requires minimum Java 17. Okay, you can use Java 18 or higher, but make sure that if you are using Spring Boot 3 to develop the RESTful web services or microservices, then you have to use minimum Java version 17. What is the default logging implementation offered by Spring Boot? Option A, by using log4j, option B, by using logback, option C, by using self4j, option D, by using Java util logging. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose your correct option. The correct answer is option B, that is by using logback. The default logging implementation offered by Spring Boot is Apache Logback. Spring Boot uses logback for logging configuration if it is available on a class path along with self4j as a logging packet. What is the default scope of a Spring Bean in a Spring Boot? Option A, prototype, option B, request, option C, singleton, option D, session. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose your correct option. The correct answer is singleton. In a Spring Boot or a Spring Framework, the default scope of a Spring Bean is singleton. This means that only one instance of the bean is created and shared across the entire application. What is the minimum version of Java is required for Spring Boot 3? Option A, Java 8, option B, Java 11, option C, Java 17, option D, Java 21. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose the correct option. The correct answer is Java 17. Well, Spring Boot 3 requires minimum Java 17. Okay, you can use Java 18 or higher, but make sure that if you are using Spring Boot 3 to develop the RESTful web services or microservices, then you have to use minimum Java version 17. What is the default implementation class of JPA repository interface? Option A, simple JPA repository, option B, JPA repository IMPL class, option C, custom JPA repository, option D, default JPA repository. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose your correct answer. You can also comment out in a comment section. Well, the correct answer is simple JPA repository. The simple JPA repository class is the default implementation of JPA repository interface in Spring Data JPA. It is provided by Spring Data JPA framework and serves as a generic repository implementation for performing common CRUD operations and other database operations. Just remember, simple JPA repository class is the default implementation of JPA repository interface in a Spring Data JPA. Here is one more quiz question on Spring Boot. Which is the default HTML template in a Spring Boot? Option A, JSP, option B, free marker, option C, Thymeleaf, option D, Groovy. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose your correct answer. You can also mention your correct option in the comment section as well. The correct answer is ThymeLeap. The default HTML template engine in Spring Boot is ThymeLeap. The ThymeLeap is modern server Java template engine that is designed for both web and standalone environments. When you create a new Spring Boot application with Spring Boot Starter ThymeLeap dependency, then Spring Boot enables ThymeLeap as a default HTML template engine. Spring Boot automatically configures ThymeLeap with sensible defaults, making it straightforward to start using ThymeLeap for rendering HTML templates in your web applications. Here is one more quiz question on Spring. Which Spring annotation is used to create RESTful web services using Spring MUC? Option A, at REST controller annotation. Option B, at controller annotation. Option C, at component annotation. Option D, at REST annotation. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose your correct option. You can mention your correct option in a comment section as well. Well, the correct answer is at REST controller annotation. When you annotate a class with at REST controller, it indicates that the class is Spring MUC REST controller and it is responsible for handling incoming HTTP requests and generate the appropriate HTTP responses. Alright, so whenever you develop the RESTful web services using Spring MUC, make sure that you annotate a class with at REST controller annotation. Here is one more quiz question on Spring Boot. Which embedded server does Spring Boot provide by default for web applications? Option A, Jetty. Option B, JBoss. Option C, Apache Tomcat. Option D, Undertow. Well, you have 5 seconds to choose your correct option. You can comment your correct answer in a comment section. Well, the correct answer is Apache Tomcat. Well, Spring Boot by default provides Apache Tomcat as a embedded servlet container to quickly run the Spring Boot web applications. We don't have to set up the external server to deploy the Spring Boot web applications. Alright, Spring Boot offers an embedded Apache Tomcat server out of the box, allowing web applications to be easily run without external server setups. Alright, great. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is the question. What is the role of Spring Boot application annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, it is used to define a batch job. Option B, it is used to mark a configuration class. Option C, it's equivalent to using configuration, enable auto configuration and component scan annotations. Option D, it is used as a substitute for application.properties file. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option C. It is equivalent using configuration, enable, auto configuration and component scan annotation. Well, Spring Boot application annotation is a combination of 3 important annotations: configuration, enable, auto configuration and component scan. This Spring Boot application annotation, it marks a main entry point class in a Spring Boot application. And Spring Boot application internally uses enable auto configuration annotation to enable auto configuration, which automatically configures the Spring Boot application based on the dependencies included in the project. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is the one more question. What is the purpose of Spring Boot Actuator? Option A, to monitor and manage application health. Option B, to start and stop the application. Option C, to generate application documentation. Option D, to provide user authentication. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option A, to monitor and manage application health. Well, Spring Boot Actuator provides a set of endpoints for monitoring and managing Spring Boot applications in a production. It exposes the REST endpoints for health checks, metrics, environment information, and other runtime details, making it easier to maintain and troubleshoot the applications. Actuator helps improve visibility and control over the application's performance as well as behavior. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the purpose of REST controller advice annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to handle exceptions for REST controllers globally. Option B, to configure REST endpoints. Option C, to apply caching for REST controllers. Option D, to configure security for REST endpoints. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option A, to handle exceptions for REST controllers globally. Well, the REST controller advice annotation in a Spring Boot is used to handle exceptions globally for REST controllers. This annotation works similar to controller advice annotation, but this REST controller advice annotation is specifically designed for RESTful web services. When an exception is thrown in a REST controller advice annotation intercept that exception and it provides a custom response for that exception and return the custom error response back to the client. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is the one more question. What does the auto-wired annotation do in a Spring Boot? Option A, manually inject dependencies into fields, constructors or setters. Option B, automatically inject dependencies into fields, constructors or setters. Option D, automatically create a new instance of a class. Option D, mark a bean as a lazy initialized. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B. It automatically inject the dependencies into fields, constructors and setter methods. Well, auto-wired annotation in a Spring Boot is used to automatically inject the dependencies into fields, constructors and setter methods. This annotation is a part of Spring Framework dependency injection mechanism. This reduces the need for manual wiring of dependencies and promotes a more modular and decoupled code base. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here's the one more question. How can you customize the banner in a Spring Boot application? Option A, modify the application.properties file. Option B, adding a banner.txt file in a class path. Option C, writing custom Java code. Option D, using Spring Boot CLI. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, adding banner.txt file in a class path. Well, to customize the banner displayed at a startup, you can add a banner.txt file to your class path and Spring Boot will automatically use it as an application banner. So place banner.txt file in a resource or directory. Spring Boot will automatically pick up this file and display its content at a startup. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What does the configuration annotation do in a Spring Boot? Option A, it marks a class as a Spring component. Option B, it marks a class as a source of bean definitions. Option C, it marks a class as a Spring controller. Option D, it marks a class as a RESTful service. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B. It marks a class as a source of Spring beans. Well, the configuration annotation in a Spring Boot is used to mark a class as a source of bean definitions. Well, whenever we want to define a Spring beans using @bean annotation, then typically we create a class and we annotate that class with @configuration annotation, and within that class we define the Spring beans using @bean annotation, right? So basically, in order to configure the beans using Java-based configuration, we use @configuration annotation. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is the one more question. What is the use of component scan annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to scan and load properties files. Option B, to automatically detect and register beans in application context. Option C, to configure database connections. Option D, to schedule tasks in an application. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, to automatically detect and register beans in application context. Well, component scan annotation is used in a Spring Boot application to scan packages for a component such as @component, @service, @repository and @controller annotated classes, and it automatically register those components as a Spring beans in a Spring application context. It simplifies the bean management by eliminating the need for manual bean definitions. Okay. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is the one more question. What is the purpose of configuration properties annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to define a custom error pages. Option B, to handle exceptions globally. Option C, to configure component scanning in an application. Option D, to bind external configuration properties to a Java object. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option D, to bind external configuration properties to a Java object. Well, configuration properties annotation in a Spring Boot is used to bind external properties like application.properties or application.yml file to a strongly typed Java object. Well, this annotation is pretty useful because it will help us to automatically bind the external properties to a Java object fields directly. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the use of WebClient in a Spring Boot? Option A, to handle HTTP requests and responses in a reactive way. Option B, to replace REST template with non-blocking client. Option C, testing REST APIs. Option D, both A and B. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option D, both A and B. Well, Spring Boot's web client is a non-blocking reactive client that is used to handle HTTP requests and responses in reactive way. Spring team recommended that web client is going to be a replacement for REST template. The web client is a part of Spring WebFlux module and it supports both synchronous and asynchronous communication. It provides a flexibility and powerful way to interact with the RESTful web services, making it ideal for modern scalable applications. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is the one more question. How can Java records be used with the Spring Boot applications? Option A, as a replacement for Spring Beans. Option B, to define immutable data transfer objects. Option C, to replace all Spring controllers. Option D, as a substitute for application.properties file. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, to define immutable data transfer objects. Well, Java records can be effectively used in a Spring Boot applications to define immutable data transfer objects. Well, here data transfer object is basically a design pattern that we use to transfer the data between client and server. Since records are designed to be immutable and concise, so they are excellent fit for DTOs where the focus is on carrying data between different layers. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the purpose of service annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to define a main entry point of the application. Option B, to indicate that a class is a Spring service component. Option B, to configure a security settings. Option D, to map HTTP requests to handler methods. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, to indicate that a class is a Spring service component. Well, @service annotation in a Spring Boot is used to indicate that a class performs service-related business logic. It helps in marking a class as a service layer component, which Spring automatically detects and registers as a Spring Bean, making it available for dependency injection in other parts of the application. Well, we typically use @service annotation to make a class as a Spring component in a service layer, and within that service component we keep all the business logic of the application. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. How are static resources served in a Spring Boot web application? Option A, using custom controller to map static files. Option B, through the static folder under src main resources folder. Option C, by adding them to the application's root package. Option D, through the application.properties configuration file. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, through the static folder under src main resources. Well, we don't have to manually configure the location of the static files. Spring Boot will automatically pick up all the static files like CSS files, JavaScript files and images from the directories which are located under this directory, src main resources directory. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the use of @scheduled annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to schedule HTTP requests. Option B, to define a scheduled task that run at a fixed intervals. Option C, to configure applications start behavior. Option D, to register beans automatically in application context. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. Well, the correct answer is option B, to define a scheduled task that run at a fixed intervals. Well, @schedule annotation in a Spring Boot is used to schedule a task to be executed at a specific intervals or time. This annotation helps you to run methods automatically at a fixed rate with a fixed delay or according to cron expressions, making it useful for automating periodic tasks in the application. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the use of query annotation in a Spring Data JPA? Option A, to establish database connections. Option B, to define custom SQL or JPQL queries for repository methods. Option B, to map entity classes to database tables. Option D, to perform batch updates in the database. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, to define a custom SQL or JPQL queries for a repository methods. Well, the query annotation in a Spring Data JPA allows you to define a custom SQL or JPQL queries directly in the repository methods. So this provides a flexibility when the default query generation is insufficient or when more complex queries are required. You can write both native SQL and JPQL queries using this query annotation. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the purpose of path variable annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to bind a query parameters to a method arguments. Option B, to map form data to a model object. Option C, to extract values from the URL path and bind them to the method parameters. Option D, to handle file uploads in a web applications. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option C, to extract values from the URL path and bind them to the method parameters. Well, add path variable annotation in a Spring Boot is used to bind values from URI path to a method parameters in the controller. It allows you to capture dynamic parts of the URL and use them within a method for processing, such as retrieving the specific resources based on the ID. Well, whenever you want to extract the data from the URL and directly bind to the method parameters, you can use add path variable annotation. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the use of add request param annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to bind form data to a model object. Option B, to extract query parameters from the URL and bind them to the method parameters. Option C, to configure database connections. Option D, to secure certain endpoints in the application. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option B, to extract query parameters from the URL and bind them to the method arguments. Well, add request param annotation in Spring Boot is used to bind a query parameters from the URL to a method parameters in the controller. This annotation allows you to access request parameters and pass them into your method for processing, making it useful for handling form submissions or filtering the data. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the use of exception handler annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to handle a scheduled task. Option B, to map HTTP requests to methods. Option C, to handle specific exceptions in a controller or globally. Option D, to manage database transactions. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option C, to handle specific exceptions in a controller or globally. Well, add exception handler annotation in a Spring Boot is used to define the methods that handle specific exceptions in a controller. It allows you to manage the exceptions that occur within a controller by providing a custom responses or actions when an exception is thrown, enhancing error handling in the application. We can also use add exception handler annotation to handle the specific exceptions globally. Welcome to Spring Boot quiz series. Here is one more question. What is the use of add transactional annotation in a Spring Boot? Option A, to define the transactional isolation level. Option B, to handle security configurations. Option C, to manage database transactions automatically. Option D, to execute methods asynchronously. Well, you have 5 seconds to answer this question. The correct answer is option C, to manage database transactions automatically. Well, add transactional annotation in a Spring Boot is used to manage the database transactions automatically. When you apply this annotation to a method or a class, it ensures that all the database operations within a method are executed within a single transaction. If any exceptions occurs, the transaction is rolled back, ensuring that the data consistency. This annotation simplifies the transaction management in a Spring Boot applications.